Hi everyone, in this video we are going to discuss the environmental harm that is associated with food production. So usually when I ask my students here on campus, what is the biggest process or the worst process for our environment during the production of food? Almost always they say, oh, it has to be transportation. It is the process of picking up the food at the farm, driving it to the warehouse, then driving it to the grocery store, then driving it from the grocery store to the person's house or to the school or to the office or wherever the food is going. Usually that's the number one answer, and that is not even close to being true. Transportation only accounts for about 9% of the environmental harm during this food process. The real kicker, the real issue, is the actual production at the farm. So let's look at a table or a chart of the breakdown of this process. So what we're going to look at right here is actually the pie chart of the annual carbon footprint of food production. Annual carbon footprint of food production. And so what we can see here is right away the biggest issue or the biggest offender is the production of the food at the farm. That accounts for 67% of the greenhouse gas emissions, specifically the carbon ones, so carbon dioxide and methane, the two worst ones for global warming. And so we can look at all these graphs and we can see the production at the farm is absolutely terrible. It's definitely the worst. We see that the refrigeration and the processing process is definitely bad. But we've already talked about the greenhouse gases that are associated with the refrigeration process, so I'm not going to spend much time on that today. But if you are can't remember what it is, please go back and look at your unit when we're talking about CFCs and the CFC replacements, okay? And the other section usually is associated with something that is unique to the crop. So it might be something that's unique to the corn or maybe asparagus or maybe steak, but there's some specific process that's unique to that one that you can't say globally. The transportation issue is what we've already discussed. It's definitely the process of burning gasoline using an internal combustion engine during the process of driving the crop from the farm to a big warehouse where they process it or package it perhaps. Then you drive it out to a warehouse for a specific company. So if we're talking about HEB, you drive it to the HEB warehouse. Then that from the warehouse that goes out to the specific stores. So then we talk about the HEB that's right here near campus. And then what happens is you have the transportation when someone like me goes to the HEB and I pick up my food and then I drive it out into my home or I drive it to work. That's all the transportation process, so that we know the greenhouse gases, methane, everything that's released during the combustion process of an internal combustion engine. So we've already focused on those. But the two I really want to talk about today are the packaging process and the production at farm. So let's look at these individually. The first one I want to look at is the production at farm because that's the worst. So the production at the farm really has three main components that I want to focus on. And the first one is something that hopefully you already know, but you might not be familiar with. And that is the fact that you have to use farm machinery a lot of times at farms in order to create your product or maybe take care of it or do something to it. For example, I grew up in Michigan, and a lot of times in the summer for a summer job, what you do is you husk corn, and so you get up really, really early, and what you have to do is stand on the end of this huge machine, and it drives to the cornfields, and you're just pulling the husks off the corn. I never did it personally, but my brother did, and his hands are always awful, and it's just a terrible job. But these huge machines just take so much gasoline, and they're horribly inefficient. If you've ever been near any of these farm machines, they're always spitting out puff, or maybe I was just around the bad ones. Maybe it's gotten a lot better, but they definitely are constantly putting out carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's really bad, a lot worse than you would assume for it to be. The second one is something we're going to talk about in a future video, but it's fertilizer. And so essentially what happens is you have fertilizer all over your fields. And so what they do is they simulate these microbes. And the microbes basically are inside your solid soil. And so what that happens is when you've got these microbes that are simulated, they basically are able to release nitrous oxide or N2O. And we know N2O is definitely a very good greenhouse gas, and it absorbs that incident IR radiation. And so that's one of them, but we'll talk about that in the future. And then the last one I want to talk about for the production at farm has to do with the farm animals. And I just want to remind you of something that we've already discussed, but we know that farm animals have to eat. And when they eat, oftentimes their digestive system creates gas, and then they release the gas into the atmosphere. So our cows and our sheep are always releasing methane into the atmosphere. And we know methane is much worse for the planet than carbon dioxide is. So I just want you to keep those in your mind. But these these are the big three. And so these three things actually account for 67% of the carbon emissions every single year when we're talking about the process of food production. So it's really bad, okay, really, really bad. The second one I wanted to talk about was packaging. And so now I know this only accounts for about 7%, but it is a very, very unique process that we don't get to talk about a lot in this class, so we do want to spend a little time on it right now. And the first one we want to talk about is the production of the raw materials. So if you think about packaging, think about a box, right? If you're going to ship something in a box, you need to make the cardboard, or more accurately called the corrugated paper, that you are going to use to create the box. And the second thing is you need to talk about the fabrication of the actual box. Boxes don't just grow out in nature. And so I want to talk about these two really quickly. So something that most people don't know about me, I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this, but I've actually spent 2 summers working at a box plant in Michigan. And so what you do there is I was actually working as a quality assurance person. I made sure that the boxes were of good integrity. But let me just describe the process of how a box is actually made. And so you start at the very, very beginning, at least at the plant I worked at. And so you have 3 pieces of paper, and it's these huge, huge, huge rolls of paper. And so what happens is that on the outside you have these straight pieces of paper, and so they're shot in like this, and it's actually like this right here. And so then you have this third one that goes in the middle. And the third one is wavy. So if you've ever looked at a box, if you look at the actual corrugated paper, it's usually 3 pieces or 6 pieces depending on how thick you need it. But for a 3-piece box, all you have is the 2 on the outside and the 1 in the center that squiggles. And so what you do is you then glue all these together. Now this machine that does this and creates this actual corrugated paper is the length of a football field. Okay, it's huge. It's huge, huge, huge. It takes so many people to operate this one machine. So it glues all this paper together, then he keeps going. It keeps going through the machine. So then you have these huge knives that go down and they cut the paper into different sections, so like squares or rectangles. So at that point, that machine is done. Okay, so you grab the paper, the corrugated paper for that specific order, and you pull it over to these 7 other machines on the other side of the plant. Now here you either have die cutters or these other machines, I can't remember what they're called, but they're whatever, there's 2 different types. The die cutters are the really fascinating ones. And what they do is they cut down of the paper, and so they cut it into the appropriate size. But they also can either put like perforated edges, so they have these knives that only go halfway in, or they can put a nice long dent or a crease in there. So you cut the piece first, and then it goes to the second section, and that's when they grab the sides and they put it together and you glue the box together. So by the end, you start off with a very thin piece of paper, a piece of corrugated paper. By the very end, it comes out folded and glued together like a box, a flattened box. So it's really neat. Or other customers use the other machine, whatever that one's called, and these are more like the Coca-Cola group. And so what they want you to do is just pre-cut the paper for you. They don't want you to actually smack it together and glue it together, but they do want the sticky stuff on the side so it's ready to be made. So then what happens? You fabricated the boxes already. After you've done this process, you have to transport it out to the customer. So this is the transportation. So this transportation is not included in the transportation that we already discussed. So now you drive these boxes out to the warehouse. So let's talk about Coca-Cola. So you drive it out to the Coke company. And then there, they put the boxes through their own machine. That machine then puts the Coke cans into the system. Then it puts the piece of paper through, and then it boxes it all up right there together. Then you send that out. So now you have the transportation of this component there out to wherever it's going. So the Walmarts, the H-E-Bs, wherever it's going out, that's the transportation process there. Every single piece of this is all contributing to your carbon emissions. It's terrible. All right, so that gets the product out to the consumer. What happens after it's at the consumer and it comes back? Well, now we have to talk about the disposal. And so this disposal section can be broken into 3 different pieces. You can either recycle your box, or you can burn it, so you have combustion, or you can put it into a landfill. So usually we say there's 3 different sections. So now if we recycle it, usually that's associated with carbon dioxide, because you have to take your box or whatever it is you're recycling and drive it back to a plant that can actually recycle it. So usually that's a transportation issue. Combustion, we know, is just when you burn something. So that's transporting it from wherever you're throwing it away, putting it to wherever you're going to burn it, so then you burn it and you're releasing more carbon dioxide out. So it's tons. The combustion process is the worst because you're releasing tons of carbon dioxide. Or you can put it in a landfill. Now, we've already discussed this, but in a landfill, there's specific bacteria that's all the way at the bottom, so that when oxygen cannot get all the way down to the product that's all the way at the bottom, this bacteria can break it apart, releasing methane. My question to you is, what is the name of the bacteria that does this, that decomposes the products or the food waste essentially into methane? What's the name of that bacteria? Go. All right, did you get an answer? Hopefully you did. I really hope this was at the front of your brain and you didn't have to look it up, but maybe you did. And the correct answer was definitely anaerobic bacteria. So if you recall, this is the bacteria that is able to decompose organic compounds without the presence of oxygen. And instead of creating carbon dioxide as a product, they actually create methane. Okay, so this is what happens in a landfill. So the last thing I want to talk about in this video is the carbon dioxide's emissions that are related to producing a kilogram of each specific food. And so what you can see here very, very quickly is that if you have to use a farm at all, so both steak and cheese are always related to farms or the production of food at farms, we know immediately based on the graph we just looked at that it's going to be releasing a lot of carbon dioxide, and that's all because of the farm machinery, your fertilizer, and your farm animals. Okay, all three of those are directly related to carbon dioxide emissions. However, if you can eat local things, so things that are grown here in Austin for me personally, if I can eat the tomatoes that are grown here locally or the carrots that are grown here locally, it's so much better for the environment. So I'm going to leave you with that. We're going to ask one last question here. If you have the option to either eat fresh tomatoes or canned tomatoes, which one would you eat? Okay, you have the option. Now, I hate tomatoes. This is a bad question. But which one should you eat in terms of environmental harm? Go. Did you get an answer? Hopefully you did, because it's right here. If you have the option between the two, please, please, please eat your fresh veggies if you can. It's so much better if you're at all concerned about the environment. So I'm going to leave you with that. Take care of yourself. Have a great week. Eat your fresh veggies.